If you found this topic helpful, I think you will love my self-study course, The Trauma Recovery Method, Discovering Resilience, Reconnection, and Healing Through Mindfulness. I hope you choose to join me. The link is in the description below. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about big T and little t trauma. Trauma is essentially a normal response to an abnormal experience. What gets difficult is that we're all wired the same and differently at the same time. So what you might deem as traumatic might not be what I deem as traumatic, and vice versa. There are many, many factors when we're looking at trauma, but one of the easiest ways to define it is what we would call big T versus little t trauma. So big T traumas are those extraordinary events that are highly overwhelming, the things we would expect to say are traumatizing. So things like violence, car accidents, death, and things like this, things that we absolutely know within the human condition that we can't handle. Little t traumas are those traumas that exceed our ability to cope. And they cause a disruption in our system that affects ourselves in the same way that big T traumas do, but they're much more subtle. They're much more individual, and they really are very different for everyone else. Essentially, trauma isn't about what's happened, but it's about what happens next and the story that we start to create about why it has happened to us. Often it can be just as traumatizing to have someone not believe our story, not believe something that has happened to us. And that can be just as upsetting as the event itself. It's all the unfolding of the events that happen after a trauma that really, really affect our nervous system. So when we go back to the idea of big T trauma, these are the ones that are obvious. These are the ones that we would absolutely come to counseling for. The little t traumas are the ones that accumulate over time. They are deeply personal and sometimes cause more hidden effects because we don't talk about them. They can become disenfranchised. They can go underground. And they're often cumulative. So often it's the story of something happened to us when we're 8, and then when we're 12, and then maybe something when we're 15 that reinforces this story of trauma. And these are the things that start to create our personality, start to create the things that we struggle with in terms of our mental well-being. So often the coping strategies that we develop over time come out of little t traumas. So the way we manage to keep ourselves safe might be things like becoming overly anxious or worrying, starting to people please, starting to self-harm, maybe doing different things that are maladaptive strategies. These are also the things we tend to keep hidden from other people. We don't want people to see that we've come up with these strategies. We often feel an incredible amount of shame in the way that we've been able to cope. So it's exciting in these days because we've come so far in our understanding of trauma that we're starting to talk about it more openly as a society. Now, when we talk about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, that is a different thing than big T or little t trauma. So PTSD is the mental health condition that is triggered by experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event. Whereas big T traumas may end up in PTSD, and little t traumas are the many, many bumps and bruises we get along the way in life. So statistically, about 85% of the population will have at least one big T trauma and multiple little t traumas in their life. But only about 8% of the population will end up with PTSD. So as we're starting to talk about trauma more and understand trauma more, we're starting to also destigmatize that even though we've had difficult things happen to us, and even though it has affected our mental health, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will end up with a mental health condition as a result of these traumas. We are really just starting to understand how the body, brain, and mind are affected by this, because it really is a whole system body approach. It becomes a bit like a feedback loop. So we take in through all of our senses, our eyes, our ears, everything that's happening to us. And then that goes into our body, and our heart rate increases, and our stomach clenches, and our cortisol and adrenaline start pumping. We go into fight or flight. And so now not only are we experiencing through the senses, but our body is trying to make sense of what's happening. And our brain is also cataloging what is happening. So when we are then presented with a similar issue where we feel like we might be in danger, and it might not look like it's dangerous, our body and our brain reacts in the same way, which is essentially what a trigger is. So when our trauma is triggered, the body and the brain remember what it was like to be in that terrifying place, and they're actually trying to protect us by acting in accordance to keep us safe. The brain and the body are trying to remind us we need to fight or flight in that situation. So as we talk about trauma more openly, we do start to see this shift in our culture where we can talk about how trauma affects our mental wellness and how we all have mental health. And we each have our own unique blueprint about how trauma has been stored in our bodies. How the traumas that I've experienced may be nothing compared to what you've experienced. Or you may have experienced very similar to things, but you were able to let it roll off your back for whatever reason. We are all wired the same and different. But as we talk about this more, we're able to move away from stigmatizing and labeling these things to just having a conversation about how it affects us. And this starts to allow for more healing and empowerment as we realize that our behaviors are an attempt to cope with trauma and do not necessarily indicate that we have a mental health diagnosis or that we're going to struggle with difficult mental health throughout our lives. Though it does absolutely at the same time affect our mental health and our mental wellness. What is important is to get a clear understanding of how your unique system has responded to events that were overwhelming. And what coping strategies do you tend to default to as a result of them in order to keep yourself safe? What causes one person to be triggered and go into fight or flight may not even register for someone else. So when we start to see it like this, we can see trauma as a universal experience that is also completely unique. And in order to heal trauma, we have to normalize and validate it so that our bodies and minds can learn to release it. I thank you so much for joining me on this video. I hope you found it helpful. And if you have any ideas or things you'd like me to cover in future videos, please leave them in the comments below.